Hi, I'm Jordan.
And I'm Doyle. And today there's some things I've got to say about the myth of altruism. And I know before everyone starts screaming and throwing, rocks and bottles and eggs at me about that there are people that are altruistic. I want to talk about that. I want to explain. We in terms of altruism, you think in terms of someone that gives freely or does freely or it looks out for someone else at the expense of themselves. And while it certainly there are situations where that would be an applicable way to describe it, I want to talk about why people do what they do, and then get a greater understanding of altruism and quite frankly. Maybe blow up the phrase I started with, the myth of altruism. Maybe we discover it's not really a myth. Maybe it's a different definition than what we embrace or explain. Case in point, why does a person do something charitable for someone else? Right? They care about people. That's one reason, and that's great. That's why we want people to do for other people, and we want to do ourselves for other people. Is it helps them, and that is a benefit. But is that the only benefit? We've heard many times experts, behavior experts, even psychologists and psychiatrists talk about that when you do something for someone else, you get something out of it. You get a psychological payback, for what you've done. And quite frankly, I think sometimes you can potentially get addicted to that payback. And I think that's not a bad thing. I'm not talking about it in a critical way, but it's I think when you see people that are heavily involved in charities and doing for the needy or those that have difficult times, or where there's a human need over there out there, and people see it and they want to do. They've got good hearts, or they wouldn't do it to begin with. So I think that part is part of the building of our definition, or my definition of altruism. It's a good heart. If you're an evil person, you're not going to do something for someone else, likely, unless there's some motivation behind it.
But then, by definition, it's not altruistic.
Well, that's sort of the dilemma, right? The paradox of altruism, in my estimation. Is it really altruistic if you get something from it? Well, my contention is you always get something from doing something for someone else. If you didn't, you likely wouldn't do it. Now, It may be as simple as you feel good about yourself. You feel good that you helped someone else, and not so much an ego thing. And quite frankly, that's okay. That's great. And I think that's what I think most people think or feel when they talk about altruism, right? You do it because it helps, and you get something out of it too. And there are people that and there have been examples where people will do something at great peril and expense to themselves for someone else. But you have to think in terms of what are they getting out of that? Let's say someone that puts their own life in danger to help someone that's in danger, or say when a child is drowning and someone goes and plunges in head first, clothes and shoes on, trying to save that child without thinking, because they want to save that child. They didn't think about themselves. But deep down, it's because of who they are as a person, right? They're good in deep down. But it's easy to see this truth, or to see this theory, shall we say, because I won't call it a truth, because but in science you have to prove every instance to prove a theory and become law.
Science isn't the arbiter of truth, though. That's an important thing to make a distinction upon, and that deserves its own podcast. But I'm not trying to disclaim science. I'm just saying science is not the arbiter of truth.
Absolutely agree with that. I was just making a distinction so that someone wouldn't think that I'm trying to put myself forward as being able to
source
speak.
of truth. True.
Right.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
But on simpler things, why would someone share a piece of candy with someone nearby? Right? It's not a big deal, small deal, but it's still a deal, right? It's you feel good, And why do you say hey, hi when someone you don't know, a stranger? Why do you wave? It's because it makes you feel good, and hopefully it makes the other person feel good too. I mean, that's sort of the thought. It's more about what and who you are sometimes on the small, simple things than what that other person is. It's easy to see in the significant things like someone drowning. If my child were drowning, I wouldn't give it a second thought to try to help that child, or even probably some other child, but especially if it were my child or loved one or family member. You do without regard for your own safety, trying to help save the other person. But on the small things that we encounter on a daily basis, and so this is, I think, can be seen as a simple psychological scenario situation. I'm trying to avoid, calling it a principle, but potentially a principle where people are motivated to do things because they get something out of it. Right? We tell jokes because we like to laugh, right? Or we like to make other people laugh, right? Yeah. And we get something out of that, but it's okay for both parties in an interaction like that to get something out of it. And then we start taking that and extrapolating out into more significant and more serious types of day-to-day. Why does someone do the work that they do? Their profession. Why did they choose that profession? Now, there's a million reasons, but some want to do something that's meaningful. What does that mean, right? Oh, they want a big paycheck. That's meaningful. That's not the only thing that's meaningful. Sometimes that meaningfulness can be to make a difference in the world. Sometimes, now this is where it can get a little less so and deviates from the altruistic. But then again, it does explain people doing something because they get something out of it. What if they do something negative? Right? What if someone goes and stirs up trouble, amongst people, or is an agitator, right? That they get something out of it, and so there's that motive there. Even if the motive isn't seen to be positive, so I contend that everything that we do, everything that humans do, from the things that we say, from the foods that we eat, from the places that we go, the way we spend our casual time, our serious time. We don't do anything unless we get something out of it. Now, prove me wrong. I borrow something from Steven Crowder, right? He said, he makes this statement, but help me understand from your perspective if you see that, or if you have something to add or to refute or to critique it.
I do have one critique or refutation of, especially what you said here right at the end, where we don't do something unless we get something out of it. I don't think that's precisely true. Now, maybe it's mostly true or somewhat. I don't like the word somewhat true. It may hold true in some instances. We do things that we perceive we get something from, right? That's a big difference. And
fair point. Yeah, fair point.
This is an important part of life that I think is criminally under appreciated and under focused on, which is the distinction between reality and truth, and the facts of what something is, and the perception of that reality and truth and what those facts are. This is a huge tenet of Stoicism, that you have to look at reality based on just what's in front of you, not what you think about what that means, not about what that implies. None of that. You have to let all of that go. This is something that I try to take on very seriously, and it's very hard for me. It is extremely difficult for me to do this because it is absolutely not in my nature. I don't think it's in many humans' nature, but it's certainly not in mine. And I think that making that distinction between the perception of what's happening and knowing what's happening is a critically important element into discerning, well, particularly this topic at hand about altruism, but any topic about anything, is that's the only way that you're going to make sure that you're on the path toward where you're trying to go with anything you're doing, or any way that you're spending your time. So, point being is that, yes, I think that people do things because they perceive they will get something out of it. Now, that perception could be subconscious perception. This is another thing that people don't acknowledge enough. I think they acknowledge it certainly more than the previous thing I was talking about, but not nearly enough, is that our subconscious drives a lot of our behavior in ways that I think most people aren't very comfortable with when they come and meet it face to face. That, when I go to get something to eat, I reach for the tasty, bad for me stuff, right? That's pretty natural, right? And I mean, some people are pretty conscious of that too. They still do it because, again, they perceive they're getting something out of it, and maybe they are for a short period of time, but the long-term ramifications are different. But my point being, though, is there's still a lot of things we do. For example, this is a great one. But the big example is like when you drive home from work, right? How many times have you driven home from work? Lots, hundreds, thousands. And how many of those times did you remember the entire trip driving home? Like as soon as you got home, that you remembered everything about that trip? Probably very few.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, unless there's like a wreck or something slowing you down or something just completely out of the normal, you almost never, and that's because your subconscious is driving these actions that you're doing. And we operate a high percentage of our life from the subconscious. So when someone says something like, you know, not when somebody says it, but when somebody characterizes an action as altruistic, probably not in themselves if they're using those terms. That's kind of conceited, I think, to use those terms for yourself. But if they were to characterize somebody else as altruistic, I think that they're greatly ignoring the subconsciously perceived benefits of that person doing it, which you've enumerated some of those, right? Feeling good about the situation, knowing that one of the things that you have as a goal for yourself in life is to help make an impact in other people's lives. That's not a negative that that's a goal. It's not a negative that you want to get that out of it. And I think this is starting to strike at the root of what I have a real issue with, the idea of somebody trying to drive their life through altruism, because it's a very subtle and sly mechanism to disclaim the inherent operational parameter of humans to do what benefits them alone. And people want to get upset about that, and people want to say we should shun that part of humanity. But the reality of it is that we have built systems to this point, while not perfect, have leveraged that aspect of humanity in a literally monumentally beneficial way for all humankind. And it flummoxes me to think that anybody could look at where we are as a society today with the prosperity we have, with the just general position that everybody holds, even the lowest member of any society, compare that now to the lowest member of any society 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago. It is no comparison. Like the bottom 1% of the world's population lives better than probably the 70th percentile of 500 years ago. That's ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. And all that's predicated on systems that we have that help leverage a human's fundamental, I think, and natural. And when I say natural, I mean it comes from birth with a human. This is part of the human to, do whatever is going to benefit them. I mean, look at how many systems we've put in place that have put in severe restrictions on the negative aspects of what that could lead to from human behavior. There's so many ways that we as humans just completely control some of the darker aspects of the human psyche and the human desire, just automatically. Just so much so that there's people who think that we can control everything of it and completely make that servile and subservient. And that just is not possible. It's not possible, because if you do that, and then what you're doing is you're creating a new kind of slave. You're creating a new kind of slave to some other superior system that is this system of altruism or whatever it is. And I know I took a big jump philosophically from where we started to there, but I mean, that's the path. That's where the path leads. Sure. It's not like, slippery slope. It's not that at all. It's not a slippery slope. It's flat. It's flat, direct, and broad path straight to it,
Well, it's the, you mentioned about the sense of trying to be altruistic is and referring to yourself that way is a bit conceited or egocentric or, a little haughty. and pretty audacious statement. And to combat that, I think again, this is connected with what you were saying. People to combat that, what they do is they convince themselves that what they're thinking and believing, and to your point, their perception. So what they're getting is affirmation,
yes,
right, out of their self-assessment and their
they're allowing other people to do that. They're allowing other
Correct.
people to do that. That's the thing, is they're being manipulated, and they're allowing the manipulation because it feels good.
Right. Exactly right. Again, that goes back to, why people do anything. They do it because they get something out of it. And if they didn't, then they would push, resist, not do it, or whatever. Sure. Not to say they wouldn't comply if they were forcibly made to do something. That's different. We're not talking about people doing things of their own free will and volition.
Well, it's
that they get something out of it. And
all of this reduces to, and this is really fast forwarding to a lot of the end state of my philosophy. We all have ultimate power. Every single human being has ultimate power. Do you know what that ultimate power is?
What? Choice?
Close. The ability to say no.
Yeah.
If you stand in your power completely to say no in the face of anything you don't want, no one can take that from you. They can take your life from you, but they can't take that from you. That is real ultimate human power. And the thing is that people are so afraid to do that they will capitulate to and put themselves in a subservient place to anything that will protect them from having to stand in that power, because they're afraid of that power. Mm-hmm. It's ridiculous, because why would you be afraid of such a thing? I know why, because in coming to understanding of that myself, I had to face the demon, so to speak, of having that same fear, right? Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where I think that very few humans, on a percentage basis, have ever come to the point in their life where they're really able to fully stand in that power. And because of that, the ones who are able to and have purposes that are not altruistic, but not just not altruistic, but are slanted toward things like evil and destruction, etc., they are able to manipulate in a way that's much more effective than if you had an entire population of humans who were unafraid to stand in that power.
So I think there's a simple explanation for why people are afraid to exercise that ultimate power.
They're afraid of death.
Fear. No, I don't think that's it at all. Mm-hmm. I think that some people would speak to that. I think it's something worse than that. It's the fear of being alone.
Okay, sure.
Of being the only one.
Yeah, because you have to continue to experience that. You can't. It doesn't just end with like death.
Because think about that. That's the antithesis or the opposite of standing with a group.
Sure.
Because you have the strength and the power and the collegiality or whatever of the group.
Yeah.
But if you exercise that ultimate power, you might be alone.
Right.
And your perception is just you would be alone. Otherwise, people wouldn't be as inclined to say no, right? Because that's why, mob rule, right? That's
Correct.
why people get together and they have groupthink and mob think, and then they, exist and create their echo chambers and things like that. And I think that's the simple reason. I think it's and again, that goes back to why do they do something, or the counter that is why do they not do something? It's right. Because they get something out of it.
Yeah.
And I think your clarification of my introduction a while ago, that it's not always the reality of what they get out of it. It's what they perceive they're going to get out of it sometimes, or they perceive what won't happen to them, if as the case may be. And I think I think that thread weaves clearly and absolutely through just about any aspect of life, right? And I think once your clarification of either real results or perception of the result. I mean, I had a little funny story that crossed my mind when you were describing that. men are notorious for not wanting to take directions when they're driving. And part of the reason they get because they want to be the big, and I know where I'm going, I know how to get there. And then they go, we'll go up here and we'll take a right up here. And why did they make that choice? Why would we or a man or anyone make that choice? Because they perceived they were going to be right, and they would pursue that, and they could be going 180 degrees the wrong direction.
Sure.
But their perception is that they're right, and that's why people tend to get more lost, or men tend to get more lost. They're typically, at least stereotypically, reluctant to ask for directions, and yes, I have been guilty of both of that scenario and of taking the right, saying we'll get there. We'll get.
I think that's mostly fading into obscurity as an example too, as time goes on with GPS.
Yeah, you're right. It hasn't happened many times in the last few years, that's for sure. But back before Google Maps and GPS and devices, things of that sort. But back to the serious topic, because I think this is a very fundamental and a very serious topic, and that's the motivation. And then so I think we can take that, and I'll say it's a principle, because I think it's worthy of putting there and let someone refute it if they can. That no one does anything that they don't either get something out of it, or they believe or perceive they're going to get something out of it, or they're going to prevent something from occurring. Either way, there's a result that they're after.
Sure.
And so we can apply that to all aspects of life, right? We began with charitableness, and then we've talked about some examples of, some less charitable and maybe more subversive or negative or destructive methods or objectives. So I think we can apply that to anything, right? Even a baby, right? You think in terms of a baby, and the elderly, right? The two ends of the spectrum where it's almost instinctual rather than a logical behavior that people do. That babies do things when they cry when they're hungry, right? And they sleep when they're sleepy, and they nurse when they're hungry, and they have something put in their mouth, because those are the things they understand. And an elderly person, maybe that is losing some of their memory capacity and ability. They tend to gravitate toward the things that are familiar. They tend to search and seek the things that they can remember and that they can latch onto, and they tell stories from years ago, because that's what makes them familiar. It's the same thing. It's they're still trying to recite and remember the things that made them feel good, or that had good memories and things of that sort.
Well, to me, that's also another way that the subconscious is playing out in those cases, is because they're becoming almost entirely driven by subconscious. And so anything triggers the subconscious, they immediately do it. They don't have the filter on top of it. And so that's why you see the same things kind of happening over and over again with those types of individuals.
Right. But those in between those two ends of the spectrum is where there's this struggle going on, I would say, trying to, in my estimation, trying to find a consistency, I think, right? Because that's the struggle that I think that I believe that I deal with is, at what point am I doing things more selfishly than I am for a better purpose, right? Whatever that may be. And there's nothing wrong with selfish, to a point, right? Because that's what creates, and boiling it all down, to me, that's what creates our desire to live, and survival drives our survival mechanism. Right? Yeah, is that selfish nature. It's when it gets out of hand, I think, is when it, and typically when people say selfish, they're referring to when it is either out of hand or about to get out of hand. That reaction, or that emotion, or that behavior.
Or it's going to have some sort of potential negative impact to another.
Yeah, right, to another, right? Because typically selfish behavior that drives themselves and the individual down is not nearly as concerning to others, unless it's a close member of the family or friend, right, or something like that, or associate. But then again, that person is caring for that person that's exhibiting that selfish behavior. So What does that make you think about from the standpoint of your life, your behavior, additional to what you already said about you mentioned about your philosophy. You said the end game. I think you meant sort of the totality of your philosophy, not the end game of your philosophy. Hopefully, your end game has a longer horizon.
Well, sorry. When I say end game, I mean the what is it? Reducto ad infinitum. So the final point, right? The single underlying point of it is that it's really two things. Is that the individual is the only locus of power in this world, like physically in this world. The individual is the only locus of power. That's one part. So that's the ability to say no and to not do things. And then the other side of it is, what is a framework for constructively applying that power? Or maybe I should frame it in the same direction. Constructively refraining from asserting that power. Right? That's honestly, I think that's a better way to conceptualize it, right? Because you think about humans as an ultimately destructive force, right? We're ultimately this thing that can say no to everything. We can deny existence ultimately. Clearly, look at the nuclear bombs, right? We have the ability to effectively deny human existence at this point. So we have to fashion ourselves in our mind as that way, or not fashion, conceptualize ourselves in our mind that way, and then create a framework that restricts that nature as constructively as possible, which sounds maybe what's the word where it's
sounds like internal detente.
Well, antithetical to the
sure destruction.
Well, no. I don't mean it that way. What I mean is that we have to reduce that destructive nature as far as is practical, that doesn't retard the growth and expansion and increase in creation that we can make in this place, right? Because we're fundamentally destructive, so we have to use our destructive ability to chip away at reality to reveal the thing we're trying to reveal. Because creation is more of a revealing function than it is a generative function, right? Because we're just working with what's already here. And I think that, excuse me, I think that's a really good metaphor as well, because what left me, there's a real big point that I have around that the most effective people in creation, success, whatever, are the ones who understand that when applying that destructive power to knock down obstacles to people besides themselves, those are the people who come across the most success, the most increase, the most notoriety, whatever, in a positive sense, right? To me, that is the real definition of altruism, is the person who applies as much of that destructive power that we have to not their own gain in intention, right? When they set out to knock the obstacles out from everyone else and to lift other people up and to empower other people. When that's what you set out with your intention to do, that is the person who, in my mind, is acting out of altruism. But when we put that into real terms in the world, it means like somebody who makes less expensive shoes so more kids can have shoes, right? It means, somebody who makes less expensive food so more people can eat. It's somebody who makes less expensive housing so more people can live in with a roof over their head. And you look at that and people will be like, well, that person's just doing it because they're making the money. No, the most successful people don't do it because they make the money. They do it because they're driven by the intention to solve the problem they're trying to solve. And if you don't think that's true, you go look at Elon Musk. You don't think that's true? You go look at how Steve Jobs ran his company. Now, maybe his tactics were distasteful. I'm not going, or any of these guys' tactics are distasteful. I'm not arguing that point. My point is the most successful people are the people who set themselves up with the intention to knock barriers out of the way, to lift people up and to build people up. You cannot find a counterexample, and if you can, then it's done by a non-creative means. It's done by a destructive means, right? And I'm not trying to get on a soapbox by saying this, but you look at like career politicians. What have they created? Nothing. They have destroyed things, and they have, gotten their gains off that destruction. So their intention is not set on creation, helping, knocking barriers out of the way. Their intention, whether they know it or not, and I think some do, I think a lot don't, it's subconscious that they're trying to destroy things.
Right. And I think what one of the things, and I'll deviate down this path for just a moment, and I'll pull myself back. One of the things that we're seeing in the world today is more and more examples of people not channeling that destructive power in ways that help build other people up, as you so wisely and succinctly worded it. They're allowing the selfish nature to have the upper hand, right? And I think that's a real simplistic way to look at it, but I think it's real clear.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but or they're ceding their will to another idea, group, person, mentality, and that thing is driving them. Not the selfishness per se. This other thing is driving them. They are acting as an avatar for that thing.
But yes, agreed. That's the reality of what's happening. But the perception of the person is they are becoming part of a greater thing in their perception,
right?
And so that selfishness causes them to do that, because if they weren't getting something, I contend they wouldn't even allow themselves to be the avatar, right? So they think, yes, I'm part of a greater good, or whatever this is.
Absolutely,
perception of that, yeah. So I think the principle that we've been talking about does apply. I've spent a lot of time in conversations and in thought process about this, because the first time I thought about this, it was almost a little insulting, to myself and to other people to be thinking this. You don't do anything unless you get something out of it. But when you look at it in the complex thing that is the human psyche, it makes great sense, right? I mean, we breathe in and out because we get something out of it. We get the oxygen, right? We get life. And we eat because, the food tastes good, or at least we hope that it does, or most of the time it does, or sometime it does, whatever the case may be. And it's enjoyable, but that's not, that's added on. We eat for sustenance, right? For survival. And people overeat and because they allow the selfish part to get a hold of them, and they pay for it, right? To your point earlier about some other things, that the short term, you get something out of it. The long term, one pays a price for allowing things to get out of balance. And I think in society we're witnessing things that have woefully gotten out of balance in that balance and that dynamic of selfish versus altruistic. So I think the statement of the myth of altruism, maybe we should recast that, instead of being a myth of altruism, a clearer definition of altruism.
Sure.
And I think it's when the balance of the goodness that other people get with the results or the outcome that the actor gets, when those are in the right balance, to your point, when there's a greater result for those around than for the individual, then that's where altruism is clearest. Is that a fair statement to?
I think so. I think that's a good characterization of the intended meaning of the word. And I want to take this opportunity to change our perspective on this conversation a little bit. This is why language is the most important thing, and the words that we use are the most important thing. Because this is an instance in my mind, and of course this is my perspective. I'm not trying to, again, claim that this is truth. This is what I have seen and what I've observed, is that this is an instance of the Word being without God. And so in the Bible it says, in the beginning there was the Word, and Word was with God. What that means is that understanding was at 100%. Aligned action was at 100%. That means everything's firing on all cylinders, going in the right way, heading toward the goal. That is the Word with God. This is altruism is a word that has been misapplied and has been bandied about uncarefully, and it has been really, in my mind, bastardized to the point where it's the word without God. So it is not functional. It's a non-functional word. That's why we've had to spend 30 minutes here talking about what it means. So I'm. This is probably a really radical view, but I fully believe this. I think that any such terms that have become so disjointed and disjunct from God, we need to jettison those words and don't use them anymore. And then anytime that anybody tries to use those words, you stop them and you tell them to clarify, or you ask them to clarify. That's the only way you're going to get to truth of the matter, because the reality is often people don't even know the meanings of the words that they use. They've heard them in a certain context, and they've deduced what they think they mean, and then they get into this habitual pattern of using them over and over and over, and they create their own context around it, and so they mean their context when they use the word versus what the word really means. So this is one of those words I truly believe that if anybody is saying because altruism or is altruistic, or we need to hold altruism as a guiding principle, you need to stop them and say, what does altruism mean? Right? And it's going to sound stupid to ask that question. And you really want to do it that way, because if you cast it as what do you mean by altruism, they're going to slough it off and be like, oh, what are you talking about? You know what altruism means. It's like, no, what does the word altruism mean? You have to act ignorant because you are ignorant in that context. And people don't realize the importance with feeling brave enough and courageous enough to act ignorant in those kinds of situations. Because only when you are brave enough and courageous enough to act ignorant in those kinds of situations will you ever be able to be a beacon to shine the light of truth on things. And you're not the light, you're just shining the light, right?
Right. So what you're claiming or calling for is exercising basically the ultimate power in those scenarios, in some respects, right? It's basically saying ultimate power of power.
Well, right? It's not consenting is what you're doing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's what I mean. Yeah. And in that unspecific and potentially incorrect message and situation context.
But you're doing it in a non-combative, non-escalatory way. That's super important, right? Because if you try it to be like, what do you mean by that? Or I don't think that's a principle that we should go. And when you go that way about it, you're just going to create conflict. You don't want to create conflict. Right. You want to bring true understanding, and you want to bring understanding in the people who don't even know they have misunderstanding. And you can't tell somebody you've got a misunderstanding. They'll never be open to that. You've got to show them and guide them down. You have to use the light of truth to guide them down the path toward that understanding. They have to arrive at that understanding, or they'll never integrate it.
Great. I think this is a good place to wrap up for today. I like where this path took us today. I think the principle of correct communication and, in essence, the ultimate power, exercising the ultimate power in appropriate situations and in appropriate methods is pretty resounding, as well as decomposing the word altruism and the myth of it. Because I think, despite my classification, I think you actually went back and I think proved the myth of altruism in a true sense. So I like that wrap up.
One last thing that I'll say about this, and this is just kind of a cheeky last point. People always say that the magic word always remember the magic word. It's thank you or thanks. The magic word's not thank you or thanks. The magic word is no. Always remember the magic word, no.
The magic word is no. All right. Good one to end on.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
It's my pleasure as always. So same here.
All right. We'll talk to you next time.
Have a great day.
All right. You too. See ya.
Bye.